like old times, Joe. You know, those that have followed me in politics and Senator Markley as well are used to seeing us together, mostly live in town hall meetings in Southington and Wolcott and other places. But this is a great opportunity for us to actually work together on something, even though Joe's no longer in office. And we decided just through some conversations, because we talk on a regular basis, that it might be really nice to take some of the conversations we have on our own and bring them to you, to my constituents and to people across the state of Connecticut to learn more about where we are coming from when it comes to politics. And one of the big issues that is in the news today is the statues coming down. And we just had Independence Day, and there was a lot of discussion on social media and other places about America's history and whether or not the founding fathers were good guys or they were evil slaveholders, or what the truth really is. And obviously this is a subject that's near and dear to me, and I know it's near and dear to Joe as well. And we wanted to just talk about it together and to include our friends and people that are interested. And that's why we're here tonight. So I'll let Joe introduce himself, and then maybe we can kick it off.
Well, I'm almost introduced, but Joe Markley, state senator for 10 years, and historical character almost, given how far back my first term was, which was all the way back in 1984. It's funny, Rob, I haven't shared with you, but Rob Kane, a former senator who's a friend of mine, sent me a link to a video a few days ago and said, "Is that you on the stage with Ronald Reagan?" Because he found footage of the 1984 Reagan rally in Waterbury. So I go back to there, and I feel like I've tried to expand my way back into American history for many years, and in a way have tried to have an engagement with these figures that gives me a sense of them as personalities and a sense of their character. And that's, I think, one of the reasons that I'm so well disposed to them, and that I feel the need to try to explain what their thinking was. And if the word is defend, at the moment when they're under attack, it is defend. I think that it's unfortunate that it comes to that. But I'm looking forward to a little discussion, and obviously we'll be keeping an eye on any comments you've got in terms of questions on the Facebook page.
Right. So I guess the place to start, based on what we both just said, is with the founding fathers. And I think maybe we can move forward along the timeline and talk maybe about the Revolutionary War, the Civil War, and the Civil Rights Movement, and even the present day. But I think we've got to start by talking about the foundation of this country, and whether or not it is a country founded in the practice of slavery or something else. I don't know exactly. We didn't talk too much ahead of time about how we were really going to break up the responsibilities here, but let me just say a few words from my own perspective first. And that is that, slavery was an ongoing, practice in the colonies here in the Americas before there was ever a thought about an American Revolution. And of course, slavery was something that was known worldwide. And I would start any conversation about the subject by saying that slavery is and always has been wrong. And anyone that would come forward and defend it as any type of practice that is acceptable at any point is lying to themselves. And I think that's in many ways exactly what the founders of America felt about it when they took pen to paper and drafted the Declaration of Independence. And I guess the complication is that their goal was to declare independence from Great Britain for an entirely separate purpose. And while many of them, and I want to get into the discussion of what many means in a minute, because I was crucified, I would say, is a pleasant way to put it, on some social media outlets, because I said that on Independence Day that many founders worked very hard throughout their careers to abolish slavery, which I stand behind and I can prove.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So the question is, why did they put the words "all men are created equal" in the Declaration of Independence instead of "white men created equal"? I think they did that on purpose. And I think that they were very, very keen and aware that when they were writing those words, they were actually creating a focus on whether or not slavery is something that is a moral practice that should continue in a free country. And I think it was also the match that lit the fire that ultimately caused America to abolish slavery. And I believe they deserve a lot of credit for that. And there's a lot more evidence to suggest that that's how many of them felt about it. Joe, I keep going on. Take a shot at this.
Well, yes, and let me say that the impact of these American principles worldwide, not only on our politics, but our morality, has been so profound that it's difficult to realize what a revolutionary idea it was at the time that it was first brought forth. That all men are created equal was not something, and that people would have the ability to govern themselves was not something that really had been conceived or had the opportunity to be tried anywhere to speak of in the history of the world. I mean, the closest you could come are the little Greek city-states that the founders studied so intently. And I mean, it's worth remembering that Athens struggled to maintain itself as a democracy. Athens was a smaller town than Southington. That was not a challenge to when you're talking about a democracy. To set up a democracy over 13 colonies stretching the length of the eastern seaboard and with the potential to grow like it is a very different thing. These men had what was in its day a radical vision. And like any vision, it didn't arrive with everything fully formed at the moment of its inception. The whole idea of doing something that's impossible is that you can only do it as well as you can possibly do it. And to this day, we say, of course, we're still struggling to fulfill the dream of the founders. All the more reason that we should be understanding of the fact that in the earliest days of the Republic, the struggle was even more difficult. And another thing I'll say in the defense of the United States, when Rob was saying slavery was general throughout the Americas and also throughout much of the world at that time. And England itself, the country that we broke away from, didn't do away from slavery till the 1830s, by which time better than half of the United States was free. The founders expected, even the founders who were slave owners themselves, maybe with a few exceptions, but I couldn't tell you who the exceptions were, expected that slavery was on its way out. And I think that they didn't anticipate the resurrection of the plantation system that led to the real digging in of opinions. But I'm getting into the weeds. I'll let Rob take us down the.
There's a lot of stuff we want to cover tonight, and I'm kind of keeping an eye on the clock. But I think it's worthwhile to devote a significant amount of time to this period and this subject. And let me just say that, so the American Revolution occurred because the 13 colonies sent representatives to decide what to do about the treachery and abuses that were coming from the King of England. And some of those states had much more pronounced amount of slavery as part of their economy. And of course, in order to keep a union together of these 13 states, they needed every one of them to participate to fight in a revolutionary war and declare independence. And so it was one thing at a time, really. And I think that's the part that gets lost on a lot of people when they assume that we started a new nation and we allowed slavery to exist. Well, what happened is they had to declare independence from Great Britain, and they had to win that war. And they needed every state. And some states were going to come along only if slavery was allowed to exist. And I will tell you, just reading the founders, one of the most key principles that we have to remember is that this is a country founded on the notion of individual liberty and freedom, which I know is in the face of slavery. But one of the other key components that is part of our founding is the idea of property rights. And whether we like it or not, at the time, slavery was considered a person's property. And the founders had great difficulty with reconciling the notion of individual freedom, but also respecting the property rights of people. And I think that's part of the struggle. But what's really interesting is in preparation for this tonight, I actually decided to go back and read some things that I had read a long time ago, which I guess probably flavored my opinion about this, which is mostly my love for Abraham Lincoln. And if you're looking for someone who throughout our history has kind of framed the argument about the founders, saying that they were very much against slavery, you have to look no further than Abraham Lincoln, because when he was making the case in the 1850s, that America should finally, reach its potential and abolish slavery once and for all, he writes the laundry list of the founders and their efforts and the things that had been done before. And I'm going to share an article on this thread that I read that was really, really great. It summed up a lot of this. It's a 2011 article from the Washington Examiner, and it said, Lincoln said it best, the founding fathers opposed slavery. And it starts with talking about the Northwest Ordinance in 1787, which is, the time of the Constitution's writing. They banned slavery from any new territories at the time. So clearly that was done not without a lot of debate, but something that is a step towards the abolition of slavery. And there were many, many other things that happened since 1794. They prevented any outgoing slave trade. So slaves could not be sold from America. In 1798, they prohibited the bringing of slaves from Africa into the Mississippi Territory. And in 1800, they prohibited American citizens from trading in slaves with foreign countries. So there's a whole bunch of steps. And I could go on, but I would just be repeating Lincoln's speech, which is pretty profound and amazing when you start thinking of each challenge that had to be overcome by these men to even achieve what we might consider small dents in the practice. And I will turn it over to Joe in just a second, but the one other thing I'll bring up is that I read a very great Facebook post today from a gentleman I admire named Tom Cranowiter, and he reminded us that every slave that came to the United States and the colonies before that was already a slave. They had been enslaved in their own African country by a fellow African and brought here by force and to the rest of the world. And it might seem like a small point, but when there is debate about who is responsible for slavery and who should pay the price for it in 2020, it's worth considering that there were people of both African-American and Caucasian persuasion that were both on both sides of slavery. And I would also point out that in the Civil War, I don't know that every person that was fighting on the side of the South was doing it for the purpose of keeping slavery. And I've said too much. Go, Jeff.
Certainly not. Let me respond to that, because obviously the percentage of slave owners in the South was very, very low, and was mostly concentrated among the very rich. So there was often the idea that it was a poor man's fight. But why did the South fight? There's a great story about two soldiers who first they're taking pot shots at each other and they start yelling back and forth. And after a while, they fall into a conversation. And at a certain point, the Southerner says, "Yankee, you're not such a bad guy." And the Yankee says back to him, "Then why are you shooting at me?" He said, "Because you're down here." And when the South defended the idea that the Civil War was not about slavery, but about states' rights, I think they overstate the case, because the only issue concerning states' rights that I think could have led to war was slavery. You weren't going to have a fight over interstate commerce necessarily that would lead to a civil war. But again, in the compromises that had to be made, or the acceptance of the situation as is, that was made to go forward and form a union that had some states free and some states slave, the extraordinary power that the states had in those days was a given. The question of whether there was even going to be a United States, or there were just going to be 13 independent colonies, kind of on the lines of what existed in in Middle Europe once upon a time, was not an obvious thing at all. And certainly nobody was thinking that the federal government had the power, and no one claimed right up until the Civil War that the federal government had the power to do away with slavery in the states where it existed. Again, that was the deal that the states entered into in terms of what the power of the states was and the power of the federal government. The good news was that over time, states were gradually, more and more states became free states. And I think the expectation was that that would continue indefinitely, that slavery was going to get smaller and not larger. The fight, obviously, was not over the ability of the states to make that decision themselves, but over whether slavery would be imported into the territories. I've got to, if Rob forgives me, I'm going to tell a Lincoln story, since he was saying how much he likes Lincoln.
No, we're actually good on time.
Good. Lincoln was asked about this. In fact, he said this. He told this story in a speech he gave in Meriden, Connecticut. He was asked about why don't you want slavery in the territories, and he said, if there were snakes around, if in my neighbor's house there were snakes in my neighbor's house, even if they were in the bed with my neighbor's children, it would not be right for me to interfere with them, because it's not my house. And in interfering with them in the bed with my neighbor's children, I might actually injure the children. But if I'm out in a field someplace and I find a snake, then I'm entitled to kill it. And he said, finally, the last thing I would do would be to take the snakes and put them in bed with children anywhere. And he said that is like the expansion of slavery. The difference between the toleration of the existence of slavery, the snakes, in the places where it is, and the extension of slavery into the places where it can be stopped. And like many bad things, the slave interest understood that if its expansion could be constricted, it could only diminish. And that was really what led them to, those who were determined to defend it, to fight so with such determination for it.
Right. So it seems like at the initial founding of this country and through the drafting of the Constitution and maybe the early 1800s, the focus seemed to be that they were going to slowly strangle slavery out of existence. But it really did take Lincoln and other powerful voices in the mid 19th century to actually make it happen.
You know, Rob, I'll add something too, that it took,
Sure.
in the end, it was an issue that was straddled by both political parties. The Whig Party was the more anti-slave party, but there were, for most of the time, there was a pro and an anti-slave force in both parties. It wasn't until one party was formed that was determined to be an anti-slave party that they were able to force the issue. And it wasn't until that point that it was victorious. It's counterintuitive in a way, where you'd say, well, wouldn't you be better off to have a party that had both pro and anti-slavery people, and wouldn't you get more votes that way? No, in the end, the way that the Republican Party won the election was by saying, this is where we are, and if that's where you are, vote for us. And they won the election. Always a good thing for Republicans to remember.
Right. And you know, it's so funny that you bring that up, Joe. I think one other thing that, for whatever reason, I don't know why this happens. I heard it maybe a decade ago on a regular basis, and then I didn't hear it for a long time, but now it's back. And that is this repeating of this myth that the parties switched, that somehow it is the Republican Party under Lincoln that was anti-slavery and tolerant of civil rights, and yet today it's only the Democrats and those evil Republicans. They want to oppress minorities. What would you say about that, John?
Well, that
not to put you on the spot.
No, but the Republican Party was seen as the party that promoted that stood up for the rights of freed slaves, and stood up for Black interests well into the 20th century. I think the difference became the expansion of government power, which involved actual entitlement programs and so forth. And in let me say, in very vulgar language, when Lyndon Johnson signed the bill to not to set up the Civil Rights Act, but rather to expand the Great Society and welfare programs, he said, "I've bought black votes for 100 years." This is a terrible way of looking at it. And, I guess I feel like one is accused of being a dinosaur for saying that we should live in a colorblind society. But I think the American principle of America, that all men are created equal, which means men, women, blacks, everybody is created equal, is an individual vision of who we are. And over time, I think the Democrats have taken advantage of people viewing themselves as collective interests. And I think it's the least healthy thing that could happen to our society, and that a number of our current problems are related to that. But that certainly is the way in which the Democrats have come to dominate the black vote in America. And the trouble is, once you're out of it, you're so far out of it. We don't have a party anymore in most of the places where the black vote is concentrated. And without having a party, it's hard to make an appeal, make a case, make our voices heard in that community at all.
Right. So I guess what you're saying is it really is a myth. And I know it is.
What?
That it really is a myth.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, yes. And it definitely is. Obviously, it was a softball question for Joe, and for anyone who has a good understanding of American history, the history of the Civil War, an understanding of Lincoln, and all of the civil rights legislation, and even serving in the legislature today. You know darn well where the parties stand. And I don't think they've ever changed. The Republican Party is the party of individual liberties. And I would point out that there is no greater minority than the individual. And the point of our country, the way our documents are written, is that they typically write laws in the way that accepts the reality that citizens have rights already, that you don't need a government. The government doesn't give you rights. You have rights because you're born. That's essentially the founding principle in the Declaration of Independence, and that's what's reaffirmed in the Bill of Rights, is that we already have our rights, and our laws are written to restrict the government from interfering with them. And when it comes to Republicans, we believe sincerely in a couple of principles. One, that when the Declaration was written and the words "all men are created equal" were drafted, it didn't mean that people were equal, because people are certainly not equal. Some are smarter than others, some are harder workers, some are going to be more or less intelligent, taller, shorter, fatter, whatever. People are not equal. The point is not that people are equal or that they should be made equal even. What it is that people should be treated the same by our government, and that they should have equal opportunity and equal rights no matter what. And we should not be putting people into categories. And sadly, that is where we've come, is that so much policy is written on the notion that this is a bill for women. This is a bill for the LGBTQ community. And it's sad, because what happens is those bills are presented in the legislature as beneficial to a certain category of people. And if you're someone who doesn't believe that certain categories of people should have different treatment than others, you're going to vote no necessarily. And that's what I'm guilty of. If you want to bring up various bills that have been brought up in the legislature on women's health insurance and so forth, obviously I want to expand the rights and opportunities for every person to achieve their wildest dreams and have the greatest chance at succeeding possible. But in order to do that, we cannot put one person ahead of another. And that's exactly what you do when you start writing laws that separate people into categories. And we've gone so far down that road now that it's really hard to overcome. And I think that's what happened in the late 60s and through today, is that somehow the Democrats have very cleverly tried to cater to doing things that are beneficial for various communities, including the African American community. And I think that's what Johnson was referring to. But it was wrong, and it always was wrong. And I think the end result is that many people have sadly not achieved their great chance at opportunity because we live in a society that restricts opportunity through entitlements and dependency. And that's what we're always fighting against as Republicans. But I'm getting away from our history chat. So let me go and, Joe, I know that you and I have spent more than one occasion talking about Lincoln and the Gettysburg Address and its significance at the time. And I know it's super significant in this conversation. And I have a few words to say about it if you don't steal my thunder. Do you want to remark on the Gettysburg?
And I'll fill in what's left.
Well, I would just say two things about the Gettysburg Address. If you don't know the Gettysburg Address and you have not read it or seen it, take a minute and Google it and read it. It's super short. It's like a few minute speech, but it is one of the most dramatic and most finely written things that I think you can find. And it tells the tale of America at the time of the Civil War. And it does much more than that, because Lincoln captures the essence of what America is as a country and as a people. And he basically reminds us of our core and what we're working towards. And this is something that I have repeated in several of the posts that I have shared recently, and my message that I created for Independence Day. And it's the idea that our country is founded on that key principle that all men are created equal, endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights. Among those are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That is who we are as a people. And Lincoln reminded us of that on the battlefield of Gettysburg, overlooking the tremendous number of casualties and just thinking painfully about the growing pains of this country to try and live up to that dream where we would truly recognize that all men are created equal. And he reminds us of that. And he says, this is what's happening here, is our country is trying to achieve that next level and get to become the more perfect union that is stated in the Constitution. And then he reminds us that it's our job as the people that come next to carry on that tradition and try and get us there.
You know, an even greater speech, in my opinion, and it's amazing that Abraham Lincoln was the writer he was. I've said, Rob has heard me say before that Lincoln was so poor he only had two things to read: the Bible and Shakespeare. And if you want to make a great writer, that's the advantage of poverty. But the second inaugural address, which is not very much longer, it might be twice as long, is also a great, great speech. And in that speech, which isn't really too long after the Gettysburg Address, he talks about one thing he says that I always feel, and I wish people could think about. 600,000 men at least died in the Civil War, and whether they were whichever side they were on, they died in the fight to do away with slavery. And Lincoln said, if every drop of blood drawn by the overseer's lash must be paid for by one drawn by the sword, still we must say, as was said 3,000 years ago, thy judgments, O Lord, are just altogether. And it was a wonderful way for him to state what the sacrifice of the Civil War was. One would hope an expiation, a payment in blood for a crime in blood. And the shame of it is that that payment, that in a sense, that check has been returned to us. And I think that in that action, the country went very far in sacrifice to redeem itself for what was really the original sin of America, to have had slavery here. Not something that the United States government invited in, but something that was an existent thing already. The other thing I'll say about the Gettysburg Address, because I often said it when I love stealing from Lincoln to make my own speeches better. But when I was giving speeches back in my Tea Party days, I used to talk about his closing peroration, that government of the people, by the people, and for the people shall not perish from the earth. And I've said that government of the people, to have the people be governed, we've got plenty of being governed. We don't have to worry about that. And government for the people, in other words, government saying, I'm doing this for you, we got more of that than we need too. But government by the people is the thing that we have lost track of in this country. Government by the people, and not by an elite, whether it's a political elite, an intellectual elite, a social elite, but by the kind of bureaucrats and supposed experts that Woodrow Wilson opened the door to 100 years ago, and that have really taken over the government since. Lincoln's speeches are full of wisdom. One more thing I'll say, if you can read those two and enjoy them, take a look at the first inaugural address sometime, which is a long speech, 10 pages maybe. Not a speech of an orator, but the speech of a good counsel who lays out exactly what the situation is and exactly how he's going to respond to it. The fact that Abraham Lincoln emerged out of the circumstances he emerged out of at that moment in our history is one of the things that makes me think that God's hand been in the creation of this country.
Don't get me started on that tangent, Joe. I can think of lots of examples just looking at our culture today and thinking about, gee, how did our country even come to be? Being made up of human beings, not so dissimilar from you and me and our neighbors. It's pretty amazing, especially serving in the legislature and understanding the motivations of my colleagues and the way laws are made, that this country could ever have been founded on the principles that it was. And that for a long time, people were very true to that founding. And it's only in recent days that I think we're really starting to lose sight of that. And I think it's because there is a lack of understanding of history and certainly a lack of understanding of perspective and context when it comes to the founding, the Civil War. And, you know, that's what's leading to all of this discussion about social justice and reparations and white privilege. You know, I'm sensitive to people that you know, make these arguments because I think they are doing it largely from a place of a desire to make things right and see a more perfect world. But I think they're extremely misguided. For the number of white men that sacrificed on the battlefield at Gettysburg and the number of people that were involved in slavery at all in this country. As you mentioned, Joe, at the height of slavery in this country, it was 1.4% of the country. And remember that half the country had no slavery. And there was a constant and steady decline that was put forth by white men and women who wanted slavery gone. I don't know how you go back today and blame those people equally with the ones that owned, held, and traded in slaves. It doesn't make any sense to me.
I like to say it's the arrogance of the present, that we think we've got it all figured out now. And if I had been back there then, I would have been the enlightened one, and I wouldn't have been part of my society. I think, and this also comes around to the idea that you'd say, what was the big deal about what the founders did? Because we've accepted it so much, we don't recognize what a thoughtful and brilliant thing it was. And it wasn't just an intellectual exercise. To some extent, the exact same men that had to, the same men that were drafting the Declaration of Independence were men that were going out on the battlefield and fighting. The same man that presided over the Constitutional Convention was the commander-in-chief of the Army.
Right.
They had to play both roles. And what's been going on recently, not simply not to understand and embrace the brilliance and the courage that was involved in doing that, but actually to denigrate them and to tear the statues down. I think at a certain point, it's not, I understand that the people that are riled up about it might be sincere, but I think somewhere behind it is a desire to break down this magnificent society that we've built, not a perfect society, but a magnificent society that has been able to absorb people of all sorts for centuries, like nowhere else on earth. Rob knows I lived in Spain for some time. And the Spaniards often criticized me for things they saw as injustices in America, or they'd bring them up to me. And, but of course, everyone in Spain is a Spaniard, virtually. There's very few immigrants from anywhere, at least there were when I was there 40 years ago. And once I said, but what about the way you treat the gypsies in Spain? And the fellow, who was a perfectly decent and nice fellow, but he looked at me and he said, hombre, they're gypsies. And I thought, you don't understand what it is to have a pluralistic society. You don't understand what it is to say all men are created equal. To a Spaniard, that means, hey, I'm a Basque and I can put up with the Catalans, but they don't know the challenges we have.
Right, right. Yeah, so I know that people are probably getting antsy and they want to hit us with some questions, and I think we should do that. Let me just close by mentioning the one other item that is on my list. And you touched on it a couple of different ways, but Martin Luther King Jr. is somebody we have to mention in this conversation. And I want to mention him for only two purposes. And one of them is that I believe that Martin Luther King Jr. understood our founding principles as well as anyone. Washington, Jefferson, or Lincoln. You can put Martin Luther King Jr. in that context when it comes to the notion that all men are created equal. I've been in numerous social media and personal debates with people about this subject, but Martin Luther King Jr. was very explicit. He believed in socialism and he wanted to make major changes in how this country operated its economy. But he believed sincerely that people should be treated the same regardless of their race. He wanted no extra benefits for African Americans. He wanted no punishment for whites. What he wanted was a colorblind society where people were judged on their merit. And he made that extremely clear repeatedly throughout his career as a person and a leader of a movement. He's also somebody who was an imperfect character, like Washington, like Jefferson. And I doubt that if we were really digging deeply into his past, whether his statues would remain standing as much as Columbus or anyone else. Someone mentioned to me the other day, what about the Roman Coliseum, for instance, where slavery was rampant, where people were punished, people were made sport of until their death. Where Jews and Christians were persecuted. Why is the Roman Coliseum allowed to stand based on that same characterization? And it's because we recognize the Coliseum as an achievement of our ancestors, the mere construction of it. And to me, that's what Columbus is. We are honoring his achievement in being a great explorer and someone noted for his Italian heritage. To me, that's what I knew about Columbus when I was growing up, and I doubt many people were taught much more than that. And so that's what the statues of Columbus mean. They don't mean anything else. I don't think there's any one who honors the Columbus statue because he supposedly did X, Y, and Z to the native peoples. They are honoring his, his reputation as an explorer. And
no statue in Southington was erected to offend anybody or to honor any evil purpose.
Right.
I'd venture to say no statue in the state of Connecticut. And I'd even say that when we're talking about the statues, the most controversial statues, which are the ones of the Confederate leaders, that those were erected by the men who had served with those leaders, who had bonded with them. And at the time it happened, the very men they fought against respected them enough and respected the grounds of their fight sufficiently to accept putting up those statues. And I think it's odd for us to be more offended by them than the very men that had to fight the war that ended that rebellion.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. If you read about Grant accepting Lee's surrender, there was virtually no punishment, and that was on purpose, because Grant knew at the time that there had to be a great healing in this country. And I think that's what all those Confederate statues are about, is really honoring the men who fought and died in the Civil War, regardless of what side they were on, because the full war was over and the decision was made. But there was still a lot of sacrifice in the process. All right, so we're going to invite Sarah Clark to hit us with some of the questions that have come up. And whenever you're ready, Sarah.
Gentlemen, thank you for having me. I feel like I'm crashing the history lesson, but I've appreciated the information so far. It's a great perspective. One of the questions we received was, can you give us the difference between equity and equality?
You want to take it, Joe, or should I?
You try, then I'll correct you.
Well, I don't know. I mean, I don't have a dictionary in front of me. I know that these words are used in a political context. I think we kind of covered what our perspective of equality is, which is equality under the law, to be treated the same, to have the same rights and the same opportunity. And I fully understand that, people might look and say, obviously, if you're born in the inner city and you're of African-American descent, you are going to potentially have less opportunity than someone who's born white in an affluent community. And that makes sense, but it's not universal. And I don't know that it's race-based. I would dare say that Will Smith's kids are born with more privilege than I was. I don't hold that against them, and I don't think anyone else should. What we should be working towards in our policy making is to try and make sure that real opportunity reaches everywhere, and including into those cities. And I would say the shame of where we stand today is that the focus on equity, which I would understand to be a desire to make things equal that are not, is what's caused a lot of that pain. Programs that are allegedly to help various individuals and communities end up hurting them, because they end up creating dependency and sometimes even resentment from people of all races. Affirmative action, to me, is a policy that creates more problems than it solves, because what it does is it essentially teaches someone that the only way they're going to advance is if they are given a benefit they don't deserve. And simultaneously, you are displacing someone who deserved the outcome. That's only going to create resentment. And I think both sides walk away from that with a less preferable situation than everybody had the same opportunity and we treated them beginning to end the same.
You're never going to get, if you decide that the answer is to put the thumb on the scale, you're never going to do it quite right. And the last person I want to have putting their thumb on the scale is the government. An honest measure, you may not like the measure you get, but at least everyone can accept, or ought to be able to accept, the fact that it was fairly done. And equality of opportunity, certainly the Republicans would say we want equality of opportunity. We cannot guarantee equality of outcome. Equity in its true sense would be that kind of fairness. I think that would give everyone a chance. And that's it. We've done that one.
So I'm understanding that you're saying that you probably answered this. So can or should government action determine or provide racial equality or equality of any sort? I guess what you're saying is no, it's not the government.
It can't impose equality. It can guarantee the liberty. The government can guarantee or ought to try to create a situation in which people have liberty to pursue their ends. Exactly what it says. Those fundamental rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. What we do with that has to be our own responsibility, and we have to go back. And we've wandered far astray from that, from saying, I'm responsible for my life, both for good or bad. And maybe somebody will give me a break and provide a cushion for me if I really screw up. But I can't expect them to make up for entirely for the mistakes I make. That's the kind of crutch that only weakens people over time.
Right, I agree. It all comes down to personal responsibility and recognizing that we are equal under the law. The laws in this country, and obviously it took time to get there. Women did not have the right to vote, blacks didn't have the right to vote, but they do now. And today, the laws say we are treated the same. And that's the way it should be. The problem will always be a cultural one. So the question is, what perpetuates our cultural differences or our acceptance of one another? And I'm on the side of treating people fairly and equally, because I think that's the direction you go to having a culture of equals and not separation or identity politics.
So you're asking about what perpetuates it, but how about what changes it? Do you think it would require a reform or a reform movement to change society or to change how politics work?
Good. That's a good question. You're pushing us a little bit on it, Sarah. I think
you were hired to give out softballs.
Yeah, no. I like that.
No, we want to be challenged. Yeah. This is how we learn. That's why I told you before, and Sarah will confirm this. I said, I don't care. Give us the most ridiculous questions. I don't, because I'm happy to discuss them. I really am not afraid of a single thing. I want people to know what I think, and I think I can back it up. I think that's the important part. Being in politics, you have a lot of time to weigh all these issues and understand the ramifications of all of the different policy choices. And sometimes those things are not readily apparent. It's one of the frustrations of being in politics is that, anyone is entitled to their opinion and they all have equal value, except some of them are decided in 10 seconds off a soundbite and some are not. Some are, grounded in research, understanding of, the policy and implications of it. I interrupted you, Joe. I'm sorry.
Yeah, what I was going to say is the question of, do we need some kind of policy to encourage people to embrace equity or whatever we want to call it? I think it's almost, again, we're all children in the end. The older you get, the more you realize that you're still a kid deep down inside anyways. You haven't changed that much. The last way that you get a kid to do something is by telling him he has to do it. Why can't you like Johnny? It's like, you're sure not to. That's never going to work. What works, again, is freedom. I think the greatest enemy of racism in the United States is capitalism. That if somebody can make money by working with somebody, they're going to work with them. I often think I knew a used car lot up in Hartford that was run by an Israeli and a Palestinian. They were partners together. And I always thought that can only happen here, and it can only happen because they both want to make a buck. And when you're in that situation, then you say, this guy isn't so bad. I would say it's also a thing about Americans generally. Even the people that have prejudice about abstract folks. Once you work with somebody, you might not like them, but as often as not, most of the people you work with and you like them as a person. And you don't like them as a Black person or an Asian person or a Native American person. You just like them as Bob or Jim or Roy. And I think that's over that kind of natural relationship and natural interaction over time is what will end it. And again, I can say, because I'm older than either of you or probably anyone listening, I have seen a considerable transformation in my own lifetime for the good in racial attitudes. And it wasn't bad in Southington, let's say in 1966, I can remember it, but it's better than it was. The kind of casual things that you would hear, you just don't hear anymore. So if we could be patient with our society and with ourselves, I think we'll get there. If we try to enforce it by, in effect, by pressure and even by threats, it's going to backfire.
So you gave me an idea, Joe, not just about the fact that some of us are more children than others. I didn't take it personally though. And I guess what I take away from that is how important a conversation about capitalism would be. So I think the next one we do ought to be about that. You just reminded me of something when you were speaking. I had a conversation with a new friend of mine that I was speaking with over the weekend, and we were talking about capitalism, socialism, and things like that. And I reminded this person that the minimum wage was created on purpose to prevent Black workers from stealing the jobs of white workers. Right after Reconstruction in the Civil War, there was an influx of free Black men coming from the South looking for work in the North. And they displaced plenty of white workers because they were willing to accept lower wages. And the minimum wage was created to prevent that and protect those white jobs. That's an example of why the minimum wage is bad, number one, but also that capitalism would have prevented that. That is not capitalism. That is interfering with capitalism. So if I'm a terrible business owner and I won't hire any African Americans to work in my factory, but then they ought to do the smart thing, which is open a factory across the street and put me out of business. That's what freedom and capitalism brings to the table, and why it's so good. Go ahead, Sarah. What's next?
I think that former Senator Markley saw this one, but the question is, do you believe that we are on the brink of separating into two separate nations? One comprised of folks believing in individualism, freedom, etc., while the other is comprised of folks believing that government is needed to deliver their needs and guarantee their happiness. From Toni Morrison.
Well, let me say something about that. I don't think we can divide on those grounds into two nations because we're too intermingled. As bad as our Civil War was, again, I mentioned before that I spent time in Spain. Spain fought a civil war that was not fought on geographic grounds, but ideological grounds. And the trouble with that is, the first day of the war, everyone just goes out in the street and starts shooting their neighbor that disagrees with them. It's the war of the Democrats against the Republicans. Fortunately, I don't think that war is likely to happen. Ours was regional, and at least we knew where the lines were. But we could have a kind of a breakdown that leads us to very severe problems in a very short period of time. One of the things, I won't drone on about this, but one of the things about our modern world is the extreme dependency. We have enormous systems, but it means that these systems are very dependent on things working, and we're very dependent on them working. So once upon a time, the food you were eating, if you lived in Southington, the food came from Southington. Now we got to count on it being able to come by processes from all over. If we start to have severe disruptions in this country, especially in the cities, if people become really convinced that the cities are unsafe because they defund the police, because the police stop enforcing the law in parts of the cities, if truckers refuse to go to the cities, these things could get very bad very, very soon. That kind of civil collapse worries me more than an actual war of ideologies, which I just can't see happening.
Right. I see it pretty much the same way. And Lord, I hope we don't ever reach that level of discourse. But I would say that it's happening already in some respects. I think people are voting with their feet. You're seeing an exodus of people from Connecticut, for example, who consider themselves to be hardworking, producing members of our society, and they are tired of being penalized for their efforts, which ultimately the fruit of their labor benefits not just themselves, but our state as a whole. And so they're choosing to go to other states where they're not going to be penalized as much. And I just see a trend that there's going to be more of that. The state of Connecticut invites illegal immigration for a purpose, and that is for the propping up of Democratic political candidates. And but that's another symptom of that situation, is you're going to see people that are seeking socialism and dependency and an entitlement state flocking to bluer states, and you're going to see people that are fleeing that for more conservative ones. My concern is that there are not enough red states, or at least red states that actually are pushing back hard enough against the tide. It seems like the whole country is becoming more and more socialist. But I think that's part of nature. It's that the government is naturally disposed to grow and expand rather than contract. But I'm hopeful that we will find some common ground. I think the answer is for people that are freedom-loving Americans who appreciate our values, to start teaching one another about some of the things we talked about here and why our country is so great and why freedom is better than free stuff. And if we can continue to do that, maybe we can combat the tremendous odds that we have against us, since the ideas and focus on socialism is rampant in education, in entertainment, not to mention government.
I think that's an excellent summary. that encapsulates the answers to the last questions I had. So,
excellent. Any more questions?
Not without bringing up things that you've already mentioned.
Really?
To beat down those answers, I'm happy to do them.
Well, there's 2 minutes left to our presentation, so rather than take any more questions, we'll wrap it up. Joe, have you got a parting thought?
Hey, a parting thought, you were talking about what do we need to do to save the country. And I really do feel like part of it is to know our history, know what the country is all about, and teach that to our children as best we can. I do feel like it's been lost in the public schools. I've been a teacher, I don't say that to blame teachers. But I got a wonderful grounding in that at little Milldale School in Southington once upon a time. And from my parents who loved America and made no bones about it and passed that on to me. That is a great heritage. We need to find the things that unite us and not focus on the things that divide us.
I couldn't agree more. This is the greatest country on earth, and it is the greatest country because of our combined history and our, structure as a society, that this country is a melting pot. It is made up of people from all over the planet. And I think I said in an earlier presentation that we made that America is unlike other countries in that it is not named after the land that we're on, or it's not named after the people. To be an American is an idea. It's, and anyone of any race and any background can identify as American if they believe in that principles of freedom, opportunity, and hard work, industriousness to make a better life for yourself and a better world for everyone. And that's why I do what I do every day. And I encourage my friends and neighbors, even if they're not involved in politics, they can influence the people that are around them. And that's how we perpetuate our wonderful society, is by making sure other people understand those values. And I'm committed to doing it, which is why we're here on this this podcast. And we're going to do many, many more. And I think next time we're going to do capitalism. I'm excited for that. And stay tuned, ladies and gentlemen, for the next one. I don't know when it will be, but I would say probably in the next couple of weeks, we'll start talking about it anyway. And thank you for tuning in. And I look forward to reading the comments afterwards. Good night.
Hey, thank you so much, Sarah. You're a pleasure to have on board.
Thanks, Sarah.
You're very
Great job as
welcome.
always.